He was right there, standing not 10 feet away from me in that crowded shelter hallway. Quiet, thin, clutching something inside his coat like it mattered more than anything. I wouldn't have looked twice if I hadn't noticed the edge of that cap. Faded yellow frayed along the brim, and marked in black ink beneath the fold, Mikey C. That was the moment I stopped walking. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Elliot Ramos. I'm 59 now, living just outside Columbus, Ohio, and most folks around here know me as the quiet guy who works nights at the shelter. But I spent over 2 decades in law enforcement before I hung up the badge. I've seen enough to know when something's off. And that morning, the day he showed up, something felt wrong from the second he walked in. But before we ever met, there was a boy in a ballpark. The date was July 18th, 2006. Cloudless sky, middle of a Pittsburgh summer. The kind of evening where the heat sticks to your shirt, and the stadium smells like popcorn and beer and hot pavement. The Pirates were playing the Cubs that night, but nobody ever remembers the score. David Carter brought his son to the game, 7 years old, bright yellow cap glove already on his hand, even though he wasn't playing. That cap was a little too big for him. Kept slipping down over his eyes, but he wore it everywhere. Said it helped him think. They got in line for a pretzel. David stepped forward to place the order, turned back, maybe 90 seconds later, and Mikey was gone. Just like that. No sound, no struggle, just empty space where a little boy had stood. The stadium locked down fast. Security swept every hallway. Helicopters were in the air by nightfall. I remember seeing the mother on the news, Susan Carter. She looked like a woman watching her whole life unravel while trying to hold her breath through it. But nothing turned up. No ransom call. No footage worth a damn. The media called it a mystery. David Carter never did. He came back every year on that same day to that same stadium gate holding a copy of the same photo. Mikey with a missing front tooth, crooked smile, yellow cap pulled low. David refused to move out of the house, refused to clear the kid's room, refused to believe his boy was gone. People whispered about him, said he was stuck in time, said maybe he just couldn't accept the truth. But I remember thinking maybe he knew something nobody else did. Maybe that's why he couldn't stop. And 17 years later, when a man calling himself Daniel walked into the shelter with nothing but a jacket and that same yellow cap, I started to understand why. I didn't say anything right away. Just stood there watching him through the glass as he curled up under that threadbare blanket half asleep, but clutching the brim of that yellow cap like it was the only thing keeping him anchored. The room was quiet except for the hum of the radiator and a flickering hallway light that buzzed every few seconds. I'd seen plenty of faces like his over the years, drawn, weathered, numb, but this one stirred something. There was a scar just above his left brow, faint but familiar. I walked upstairs to the office, pulled out an old bulletin I kept in a file drawer marked Unresolved, and unfolded it under the desk lamp. The photo had aged, the corners curling, but the boy's face stared back with the same sloping brows and that same scar. Mikey Carter, age 7, missing since July 18th, 2006. PNC Park, Pittsburgh. I picked up the shelter's landline and called the number printed at the bottom of the flyer. It was a long shot, maybe even reckless, but something about the way that man said I used to be someone else wouldn't leave me alone. When the call connected, I asked for David Carter and told him to sit down. Told him I might have found his son. There was a long pause on the other end, then a crash coffee mug maybe. He didn't ask for proof, didn't question me. He just asked, "Where is he?" 2 days later. David stepped into the chapel room behind the shelter alone. He looked older than the photo, worn-down hair all white now, but still upright, still scanning the room like a man who hadn't stopped searching. Daniel. That's what the man was calling himself, sat with his back to the door, motionless, hands folded in his lap. He turned slowly when David entered. There was no rush, no music-swelled reunion, just silence. That kind of silence that fills your chest and presses down like a stone. David took a few steps forward and placed something on the table between them. It was a plastic dinosaur, chipped and faded, the kind you dig out of a sandbox or a backyard garden. "I found this under the tree in front of our house," he said quietly. "Figured maybe you'd want it back." Daniel stared at it, then nodded almost imperceptibly. That was all. After David left, I found Daniel still sitting there, turning the toy over in his hands. I caught a glimpse of something scrawled on the underside, written in Sharpie, mostly worn away. Planted by Mikey. "It will come back." I didn't ask what it meant. He didn't seem ready. But something shifted that day. Something opened. The next morning I found him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, studying his reflection like it might answer something. He touched the scar above his eye, then dropped his hand. I asked if he wanted to talk, maybe go home, but he just said, "Not yet." Said something didn't feel right. Later that week, David brought a small cardboard box. Inside were things he'd held on to all those years. An old backpack, a worn glove, a few baseball cards, a framed photo. Daniel picked up a sheet of paper wrinkled and yellowed with a crayon drawing on it. 2 stick figures beneath a lopsided sun, one holding a glove. "Me and Dad today," written in blocky red letters. He turned the page over and squinted. I saw his face change. "There's something else," he said. It was faint, almost erased, but there on the back in pencil was a single word. "Run." He didn't show it to David. Not then. He tucked it back into the box and went quiet again. Over the next few days, he barely spoke. He'd leave in the evenings, take long walks, and come back just before lights out. On the 3rd night, he told me he wanted to visit Pittsburgh, but not to stay in the old house. He picked a cheap motel near the river instead, one with buzzing neon lights and mildew in the carpet. I offered to come with him, but he shook his head. Said he needed to see it for himself. That neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same narrow sidewalks, same maple trees leaning over chain-link fences. But when he walked past the house on Fairview, he stopped cold. The porch swing was gone. The bedroom window was boarded. The yard had grown wild. It didn't look like home anymore, just a place frozen in time. He didn't linger, kept walking. Around midnight, an older woman stepped out from a porch 3 houses down and squinted through the dark. "Daniel," she called. He turned, surprised. "It's Martha," she said. "Used to babysit you when your mama worked weekends." He walked over and they stood there under the street lamp like 2 people trying to piece together a story that neither of them fully remembered. "You were a quiet boy," she said. "Always hiding. I told your daddy I never thought that photo looked like you. That smile. It wasn't yours." He asked what she meant. She hesitated. "The day they said you went missing, I saw you in the alley behind the butcher shop. I called out, but you ran. Did you tell the police?" he asked. "I did," she said, but no one listened. They said I was confused, too old to remember. Back at the motel, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed with his laptop open, typing slowly. He searched Butcher Shop Fairview 2006. A local news article came up. Arrest made in unrelated child abuse case. Richard Kinland. That name didn't show up in the original case file I'd reviewed, but the address matched the one from Martha's story. The shop had closed shortly after Mikey disappeared. Daniel read the article twice, then leaned back. I could see the weight starting to settle in. The scar on his brow throbbed, and he reached up to touch it again. Then came a whisper almost like he was talking to himself. Not a driveway, a basement. The next morning he called David and asked, "Who was Richard Kinland?" There was a pause on the line. Then David said, "He was a monster. Lived a few blocks over. Owned that butcher shop. Had a record. We didn't know until after." Daniel pressed, Did you know him? Another pause. Then, we crossed paths. Neighborhood meeting once, that's all. But Daniel didn't believe him. Later that day, he met with a federal investigator named Monica Green. She'd worked the case when Mikey first disappeared. She was skeptical even after the DNA results. But then Daniel brought her something new, a newspaper clipping dated August 2007 out of Zanesville. It described a boy around 8 found wandering near a bus depot. No name, no ID signs of trauma. Placed in foster care. That report had never been tied to the Carter case. Daniel stared at the black and white photo. Same eyes, same scar, same hollow look he saw in the mirror every morning. He looked up and said quietly, "That was me." No one had made the connection. Not the shelter, not the police, not even his parents. And for the first time since he'd stepped into the shelter, he started to remember why. Daniel went back to the butcher shop lot alone. It had been leveled years ago, nothing but weeds and concrete rubble. But tucked near the back behind a rusted fence, he spotted something, a metal door half buried. He pulled at it until it creaked open. Stairs led down steep, narrow damp. The smell hit him first, then the cold, then the silence. At the bottom, he found a concrete chamber, chains still bolted to the wall, dark stains on the floor, and near the back wall a faint drawing in chalk. A stick figure, and a dinosaur. He stood there shaking, breathing heavy, and whispered a single word. Home. Then he collapsed. When he made it back to the surface, bleeding from his palms, the sun was coming up. Across the lot, just beyond the fence, stood a man in a gray coat, watching. And when Daniel looked again, he was gone. He stayed silent for almost 2 full days after that basement. Slept in his clothes, sat with his back to the motel door, kept the blinds drawn even during the day. He didn't want to talk, didn't want company, didn't even want food. I brought him bottled water and left it by the nightstand. When I finally asked if he'd told David anything about what he'd found, he shook his head. "Not yet," he said, voice low. "I don't know what I'm dealing with." That was the first time I saw real fear in him, not panic, not flashbacks, but the kind of fear that settles in once the shock wears off. When something about the story stops adding up and you start wondering how much of your past was a lie. The next day we sat together in the small break room at the shelter, same table we always used for paperwork and coffee. He pulled out the yellowed drawing again, the crayon 1-stick figures, and a crooked sun, and flipped it over. I saw it for myself. That faint word in pencil, run. I asked if he remembered writing it, and he just looked down. Said it didn't feel like something he would have written unless he'd been scared. That's when he told me about the voice. Not the one from the basement, that memory hadn't come back yet. This was something earlier, older. A sentence from childhood that didn't fit any normal kind of parenting. "If the door opens and I'm not there," he said, "you hide in the freezer. Don't make a sound." He didn't know where it came from, just that it felt real. He asked if I could help him find old foster records. Places he might have lived, staff names, anything. Took some digging, but we tracked down one of the house parents from his earliest placement woman named Sharon Peters, now retired and living in a mobile home park down in West Virginia. I called ahead, explained who I was, and she agreed to talk. I put the call on speaker so Daniel could hear. She remembered him said he used to line up his shoes at night, always in pairs, always straight. Said he cried in his sleep a lot, never asked for toys, never wanted noise. Then she paused and said, "One night he whispered something strange. Said, 'My daddy told me to hide in the freezer if the door opens.' I thought it was just a nightmare." Daniel looked away and didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally spoke, he asked me to arrange a meeting with Susan, his mother. She'd been living in a care facility just outside Pittsburgh, and until that point she hadn't responded to any of the outreach. But when I called and told her Daniel was asking, she agreed to see him. We didn't tell David. The meeting was quiet behind closed doors, just the two of them. I waited outside. She looked older than her age, thin, pale, almost brittle. When he walked in, she didn't cry, just stared at him and said, "You're alive." He sat down across from her. It wasn't angry, not bitter, just tired. He asked what she knew. She said she didn't know anything, not back then. Said David owed money before Daniel was born. Tried to fix it, but the debt followed him. She believed what he told her, that Mikey had died, that it was her fault somehow. She admitted she wanted to believe it because it was easier than asking more questions. That part broke him a little, I think. Not the answer, but how quickly she accepted it. That night, Daniel played an old voicemail on loop. It was one David had saved from the day of the game. "Mikey, it's Dad. We're going to have fun today. I packed your cap. Don't forget your glove. I love you, buddy. Always." Daniel listened to it again and again, before finally deleting it. No ceremony, no breakdown, just a decision. He didn't talk much the next morning, just asked if I could take him to the precinct. Agent Monica Green met us outside. She still hadn't closed the file. DNA, or not, something about the case had never felt right to her. Daniel asked for access to the full case file, but she said he didn't have legal standing yet, not until the courts processed his identity. He said quietly, "Then help me anyway." She nodded. We went inside, down to a room with storage boxes lined floor to ceiling. The box was marked Carter 2006. Inside, paper-clipped statements, map grids, officer notes, interview summaries. Near the bottom, a folded-page security report from PNC Park. A janitor had reported seeing a man in a gray coat talking to a child near the visitor's tunnel. Not on staff, no badge, no camera coverage. The report was dismissed, no follow-up noted. Daniel circled it in red pen. "I saw that man again," he said. "Last week." We made copies and left. Back at the motel, something felt off before we even opened the door. Nothing was broken, but things were out of place. The yearbook was missing. So was the padlock from the basement. The plastic dinosaur had been shattered and left on the floor. He checked the drawer. The key was still there, but he hadn't given it to anyone but me. On the floor by the door, an envelope. No name, no return. Inside was a photograph, black and white, grainy. A child in a basement, gagged, wide-eyed. On the back, in red ink. Not the only one. He brought it to Monica the next morning. She studied it in silence. "I've never seen this in the case file," she said, "but this looks like one of Kinlan's." She didn't say which brother. Didn't have to. Then she looked up. "Either someone wants you to remember more, or someone wants to shut you up." Meanwhile, I'd been running searches on Kinland properties. Richard was already locked up, but his brother Matthew was off the grid. No arrests, no formal record, just a shell company linked to a cabin property northeast of Pittsburgh, 40 miles outside town, tucked near Slippery Rock. Remote. No phone, no internet. Soil reports from the original case files showed traces on Daniel's shoes when he was found in foster care. Same match. I didn't tell Daniel right away. Figured if something went wrong, he shouldn't be the one walking into it. I left him a voicemail. "If I don't call back in 2 hours, send someone. Coordinates are in my glove box." The cabin was worse than I expected. Rotting siding, rusted mailbox windows all boarded. Back door half open. I stepped inside. Silence. Smelled like mildew and rust. Moldy mattress in the corner. No power. But along the far wall, photos. Dozens of them. Polaroids. Kids laughing, crying, asleep. Dated between 2003 and 2007. One in the center, Mikey. Yellow cap. Smiling. And next to it, me. I felt the footsteps before I heard them. Turned slowly. Man in a gray coat, thin, calm. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. His voice was flat expression, unreadable. "You're Matthew Kinland," I said. "I didn't take him," he replied. I was hired to watch. By who? He stepped closer. Some fathers will do anything to fix a mistake. I didn't move, didn't say a word, just let that sentence hang in the air. Back in Pittsburgh, Daniel received a small box, no note, inside a VHS tape and a Post-it. This is the day before. He found a player at a pawn shop, hooked it up in the motel. The footage was old, distorted. Basement view. A child pacing in a yellow cap. Daniel didn't blink. Then a man entered. Face mostly in shadow, voice low. Your dad said you like baseball. Maybe we can play catch later. Daniel paused the tape, froze the frame. The man was wearing a silver watch, black face, metal band. Daniel had seen it before, not in the basement, in a photograph. July 18th, 2006, on his father's wrist. He called David the next morning and said I watched the tape. Didn't ask anything else, just waited. David sat down quiet, then said, I knew it was you, the first time I saw you again. Daniel's voice didn't shake. Then why didn't you say anything? David didn't look up. Because I'm the reason you disappeared. And in that moment, the part no one had wanted to believe finally came out. The truth didn't come all at once, but the first crack had split wide open, and Daniel, after 17 years, was finally standing on the edge of everything they'd tried to bury. He didn't say much after that, just nodded once and walked out of the room, quiet, steady, like he already knew what was coming and had known it for years. I gave him space. There are moments when asking questions feels less like helping and more like cornering someone who's already barely holding on. He needed room to think, to breathe, to figure out what part of his past was memory and what part was something someone else had written for him. That night, he didn't go back to the shelter or the motel. He stayed with me on the old couch in my spare room. Said he couldn't sleep near locked doors. I left the hallway light on and the front door unlocked, just like he asked. In the morning, he sat at the kitchen table tracing circles on the rim of a coffee cup that had gone cold. He didn't drink it. Just kept asking questions, some out loud, most to himself. Things like how long had David known, who else might have been involved, what else had been erased. When I told him about the cabin, about Matthew Kinlan's wall of photos and what he said, he just listened. That stillness of his wasn't numbness. It was calculation. A slow rebuilding of something under the surface. He started sketching out names and dates on scraps of paper, taping them to the inside of a closet door in my hallway. Not paranoia. Just structure. If the world refused to make sense, he was going to draw his own map. A few days later, we tracked down an old intake file from the shelter in Zanesville where he'd first surfaced at age 9. It wasn't much, just a scanned form and a photocopy of his file photo, but it had one signature that caught our attention. A donation log signed the day after Daniel was taken in. A man named M. Kinlan had dropped off clothing. No connection was made back then, no reason to flag it. Just a coincidence in a sea of paperwork. But it was there, sitting in plain sight, 17 years before anyone bothered to notice. Daniel circled the name and didn't say anything for a long while. Then he whispered, "They were watching me even after." He started pulling other records, old volunteer lists, archived staff directories, anything tied to the foster system between 2006 and 2010. The patterns weren't obvious at first, but they started to show up in small ways. Similar names, overlapping contact info, housing logs with unverified check-ins. Not hard proof, but enough to feel like a thread worth tugging. He tracked down another name, Sharon Peters, the retired house parent who'd remembered his line of shoes and the freezer warning. She had one more detail she hadn't shared earlier. Said she remembered him whispering in his sleep one night, "If the lights go out, count to 7 and stay quiet." It had sounded like nonsense at the time. Now Daniel started writing it down like a code. A message left for himself when words didn't work. Eventually he asked to see Susan again. I wasn't sure what good it would do, but I made the call. She agreed to a short visit. This time she looked thinner, paler. She seemed to be carrying something heavy in her chest, something she hadn't dared put words to. When he sat down across from her, she didn't reach for him or cry. She just said, "I know why you're here." Daniel asked her again directly, "Did Dad give me away?" She didn't deny it, but she didn't confirm it either. "He told me you were dead," she said. "Told me it was my fault. And I believed him because I had to. Because if I didn't, I would have had to admit what kind of man I married." She took a breath, deep and trembling. "I wasn't brave, Daniel. I wanted to be, but I wasn't. I let him bury you, and I lived like that was the only way I could survive." Daniel stayed silent for a while. Then he asked, "But why didn't you check? Why didn't you fight for me?" Susan looked down at her hands. "Because I believed you were better off not remembering. And that broke something in me, but I didn't know how to fix it." Afterward, Daniel didn't talk much. He spent the evening walking by the river, then came back and sat with a notebook in his lap, turning pages slowly. That's when he brought up something I'd almost forgotten, an old box we'd pulled from the precinct file room. Buried near the bottom had been a sketchy incident report from that day at the stadium. A janitor claiming he'd seen a man in a gray coat speaking to a child near one of the side exits. The man wasn't staff, wasn't on any list, and security dismissed it as a misidentified parent. No follow-up, no interview. But Daniel had seen that man, not just once. He'd seen him outside the butcher shop. He'd seen him in the field beyond the motel. Gray coat, thin frame, watching but never approaching. We didn't know who he was, but Daniel was sure of one thing: that man wasn't working alone. Then came the break-in. We'd both been out most of the day. When we got back to the house, nothing looked disturbed from the outside. But the moment we stepped inside, Daniel froze. The air felt wrong, heavy. His notebook was missing. So were the photos from the cabin and the VHS tape. The notes on the closet door were gone, ripped clean. The only thing left was an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was a photo, another child, another basement. Bound but not gagged. Same wide eyes, same concrete floor. On the back, a line in block print, "We are many." Daniel stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, slid the envelope into his backpack and walked out. I didn't ask where he was going. I knew. He came back around midnight. Wet from the rain shoes, muddy eyes, glassy. He sat down and said, "There's more." It wasn't just a trade. It was a network. He spread out a folded map across the table, one he'd marked up in red and blue ink. Lines connecting shelters, supply depots, staff handovers. Places he'd never been but somehow felt familiar. And at the center of it all was a name. Not Kinland, not Carter. Just an initial scribbled and circled 3 times. D. I asked him what it meant, and he said he wasn't sure. But it wasn't David. At least not just David. Something deeper. Something organized. He stopped talking then, just stared at the map. The rain tapped softly against the windows. The house felt too quiet, and in that moment I realized what was happening. Daniel wasn't trying to find closure anymore. He was trying to find everyone who never got the chance, and he was willing to tear the whole thing open to do it. At first, it was just a faint impression, something Daniel saw in passing that didn't land until hours later. We'd gone back to that cluster of storage boxes from the original case file, looking for any tip-offs that had been misfiled or overlooked. That's when he paused over a photocopy of a ledger entry pulled from a 2007 field report, part of a separate investigation into an interstate freight operation out of Ohio. Most of the report was redacted or marked irrelevant, but near the bottom on the second page, a line stood out: Client 27. Initial contact, D. Carter. No other identifiers, no business name, no attached case number, Just the date, June 30th, 2006, and the initials that no longer felt like a coincidence. Daniel didn't say anything right away. He just made a copy, folded it neatly, and placed it in his notebook. That night after we got back, he spread his timeline across the coffee table again, stringing together what we knew, what we suspected, and what still had no shape. He marked the date in red, then drew a line from it to a file folder labeled Delivery Agreements, Private Security Accounts. That wasn't from the police records, it was something he'd found in a public document dump from an unrelated fraud case in Allegheny County. Buried in those documents was a term he'd never seen before: protective debt placement. No legal definition, no context. Just a phrase repeated in 3 separate emails between a logistics broker and someone using an encrypted sender address. Daniel highlighted it, then circled the date again. The next morning I asked him what he thought it meant. He looked tired, hadn't slept, but focused. "It's the part no one wants to say out loud," he told me. "I think my father didn't just lose me. I think he made a deal to disappear me, and I think someone kept a receipt." He opened his notebook and slid the ledger page toward me. I read it again. Client 27, D. Carter. Delivery date, July 18th. It hit harder the second time. We sat in silence for a while after that. Daniel didn't go to the shelter that week. He stopped checking in with Monica. He avoided the old case files and spent most of his time in the spare room with a legal pad and a wall of pushpins. He wasn't just researching anymore. He was digging. Not through memory, but through infrastructure property records, subcontractor invoices, staffing agencies, minor traffic violations tied to van rentals. Anything that might connect. He mapped out a warehouse just outside Youngstown that had been leased under one name for 6 months, then transferred through a shell company with no physical address. The lease ended 4 days after he was found wandering in Zanesville. No investigation had ever followed that thread. He brought it to Monica the following week. She'd been growing more cautious, bound by red tape departmental pressure. But when she saw the warehouse lease, her shoulders tightened. "That's the 3rd time that shell company has turned up," she said. "But no one's gotten inside. Every time we try to subpoena records, they go dark." Daniel asked if she could get him access to the broader database: contractor reports, transport logs, inspection records. She said no. Then she paused and said quietly, "But I can leave the room while you look at mine." That was the first time I saw her choose the truth over the process. What we found next wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to make the air shift. A scanned receipt from a repair order logged in a shipping manifest out of Beaver County. The client ID was redacted, but the repair was for a faulty refrigeration unit inside a private transport vehicle. The timestamp, 6:17 a.m. on July 19th, 2006, the day after Mikey vanished. The service report mentioned a malfunctioning lock system and a manual override installed in the freezer unit. Daniel didn't say anything, just stared at the screen until Monica printed the page and handed it to him. That night he didn't sleep. He went through every box David had given him, old toys, photos, mementos, looking for something he'd missed. That's when he found the cassette. It wasn't labeled, just tucked inside a box of baseball cards. He played it in the old tape deck we kept near the record player, static for the first few seconds. Then a voice, young, light, familiar. "Mikey, it's Dad. You're gonna be brave, okay? It's just for a little while. I'll be back before you know it. You just do what they say, and I promise this won't last forever." Daniel stopped the tape, rewound it, played it again, and then took it out, broke it in half, and threw it in the trash. "I just needed to hear it," he said. Not to remember. Just to confirm I didn't imagine any of it. The next morning he returned to the butcher lot. Not the basement, the outside perimeter. He walked the fence line until he reached the far corner where the property met an old alleyway. That's where he found it. Buried beneath a patch of cinder block and dirt, a flattened tin box wrapped in plastic. Inside was a single sheet of paper, faded and torn. A list of names, first names only, ages, and beside each a set of numbers. Daniel ran his finger down the page until he found one marked Mikey. 727. It matched the client ID from the ledger. There were at least 12 others listed, some crossed out, some circled, one with the word returned written next to it. He brought the box to Monica that afternoon. She took one look and said, "This changes everything." The list matched 3 cold cases from neighboring states, missing children between 2004 and 2008, all unsolved, all taken without ransom. None of them ever connected until now. Monica had the paper scanned, preserved, tagged for evidence. Then she looked at Daniel and asked, "Are you ready to tell them what you remember?" He didn't answer right away, just looked down and said, "Almost." Back at the house, he went quiet again, sat at the kitchen table with the list and a pencil tracing the names one by one. Then he got up, went to the living room and pulled out a sealed envelope he'd never opened. Inside was the yellow cap, the one from the day he vanished. He held it for a long time, then set it on the table and lit a match. Watched it burn until there was nothing but ash and thread. "I'm not going back to being him," he said. "Not even for a second." He scattered the ashes outside in the backyard and came back inside with dirt still on his hands. That night he started drafting his statement for the DOJ, and just before turning in he opened his notebook, flipped to a blank page, and wrote a single name at the top. Kinland was just the middle. Now it was time to figure out who was at the top of the chain. He never said it out loud, but I could tell Daniel knew what he was about to do would change everything. Not just for himself, but for anyone who'd ever been part of the system that swallowed him. The night he circled that final name on the page, the one at the top of his timeline, we sat across from each other without speaking. He pushed the notebook toward me slowly. All it said was Carter, initiator, payment verified, no first name, no title. But that was all it took. The pieces had been there from the start. Not just a deal, not just a handoff, but the man who signed the first page of it all. Daniel wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He was about to walk into the center of it. We left before sunrise. He didn't want anyone following, not Monica, not the feds, not even the local PD. If someone's watching the outside, he told me we go from the inside. The property we were heading to sat 37 miles west of the old butcher lot out near a former industrial strip that had mostly been left to rot. Half-collapsed warehouses, busted chain-link tagged doors, silence. But Daniel had traced one permit still marked as active, filed under a defunct recycling company that shared a registration address with one of the shell firms we'd seen on the ledger. The location wasn't on any list Monica had access to. No reason for it to be. It wasn't marked for storage. It was listed as decommissioned transport hub. He read that twice, then packed his bag. The warehouse itself sat low against the ground, long, narrow, with metal siding and a single light near the back loading dock that flickered on even though no one had flipped a switch. We didn't break in. The back door had already been cracked, rusted hinges and a lock plate that had been ripped free. Inside, the air was stale damp. The sound of our boots on the concrete floor echoed back in uneven rhythms. Rows of empty crates lined the north wall. Most were marked with dates ranging between 2005 and 2008. One had return, no match scrawled across it in red grease pencil. Daniel stared at it for a long time. Then he walked past, deeper into the shadows. At the far end of the building, we found a partitioned room, makeshift plywood walls bolted to the frame, no windows. The door was closed, but not locked. Inside, a desk, a metal chair, and a file cabinet that had been turned on its side. Someone had cleared out in a hurry. Papers were scattered across the floor. Daniel picked through them slowly, careful not to shift anything too much. One caught his attention, a manifest sheet. Rows of initials tagged to arrival times paired with coded location markers. No real names, just combinations like C7A or K12N. He turned to me, They were sorting people, he said, like parcels. He took pictures of everything, pages, scribbles on the wall, a corkboard that still held 3 thumbtacks but no photos. Then he reached for the floor near the corner and pulled up on the edge of a dislodged tile. Beneath it, wrapped in a plastic sheet, was a binder. It was labeled Confidential Ledger, Archive 2A. Inside were pages typed in columns. Names, yes, but also signatures, timestamps, confirmations, and one caught us both. Client 27, initial transfer signed D. Carter. It wasn't theoretical anymore, wasn't guesswork or suspicion. His father had signed off on the first move, not under duress, not with threats, just a pen and a timestamp, July 17th, 1 day before the game. Daniel stood up slow and quiet. He arranged the handoff a full 24 hours in advance, he said. It wasn't panic, it was a plan. He didn't rage or shake or cry. He just folded the binder shut, slid it into his bag and said, "We're done here." But we weren't. On the way back to the car, he stopped walking, stared at the far end of the lot where a long black van was parked, engine off, no movement. It hadn't been there when we arrived. We watched it for a full minute. No one got out. The windows were tinted black. Then, as we stepped off the curb, the headlights flicked on, and the van pulled away slow and deliberate, not in a rush, just making it known it had been watching. We didn't follow. We got in and drove straight back to Pittsburgh. Later that night, I checked the footage from my driveway cam. We'd been gone all day. But the system had picked up motion around 11:42 a.m. A man walking across the front lawn. Not a delivery guy, not a neighbor. Just a tall, thin figure in a gray coat. He didn't approach the door, just stood in the middle of the yard for 6 minutes, then walked back the way he came. I showed Daniel the footage. He didn't flinch, just leaned forward and said, "He wants me to know I'm still in the system." Daniel spent the next 3 days compiling everything we had into one file. Documents, photos, scanned case notes, maps, timestamps, testimony. He didn't frame it as a story. He built it like a record, a trail someone else could follow if he couldn't keep going. Then he wrote a cover letter, short, direct, no emotion, just facts. Sent copies to the DOJ, Monica, 2 investigative reporters, and 1 survivor advocacy group. No names were redacted, no aliases used. The next morning, I found him in the backyard again, same spot where he burned the cap. He was sitting in the dirt, legs crossed, hands buried in the gravel. I asked if he was all right. He nodded. "I just wanted to feel the ground again," he said. The real ground. Not concrete, not linoleum, just the earth. I sat beside him for a while, neither of us saying much. Then he turned and said, "I think I'm ready for what comes next." But before anything could move forward, we got word from the hospital. David Carter had been transferred from psychiatric care to a federal holding facility in West Virginia. No visitors listed, no lawyer assigned. He'd refused counsel, refused to speak at arraignment, refused even to respond to a DNA match that now tied him directly to the ledger Daniel found. He was silent, but not gone. Daniel stared at the intake form for a long time. Then he looked at me and said, "I think he's waiting. For me." And when he said it, I knew he was right. I drove him out there just after sunrise. The federal facility sat quiet, tucked in the foothills off a long stretch of road that passed 3 closed gas stations and a forgotten truck stop. No signs out front, just a metal gate and a guardhouse with 1 man inside who didn't ask many questions once the paperwork cleared. Daniel didn't bring anything with him, no folder, no recorder, not even the notebook. He said he didn't want distractions, just answers. The place smelled like disinfectant and dust. We waited in a small room, beige walls, plastic chairs bolted to the floor. No clock. A guard nodded once before opening the far door. David Carter was already sitting on the other side of the glass. He looked smaller than I remembered. Gaunt, like someone who had been living on cold trays and silence. But his eyes were alert, sharp. He didn't stand, didn't flinch, just watched Daniel as he walked in and sat down across from him. The line between them, thick security glass, seemed almost unnecessary. There was no violence in either of them, just the weight of years sitting in their chests like stones. David picked up the phone first. Daniel followed. Neither spoke for almost a minute. Then David said, "I wanted to be a good father." Daniel didn't react. He didn't even blink, just looked at him the way a man might study a photograph of a stranger he's told his family. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "You were supposed to protect me." David nodded slowly. "I thought I could fix it. I thought it was temporary. A week, maybe 2. They said you'd be safe." "You signed me over," Daniel said. "You called it protective debt management. Like I was a package." David closed his eyes. "I didn't know what they'd do. I swear." "You let me believe I was unwanted," Daniel continued. "You let Mom break." David's fingers trembled slightly, resting on the edge of the table. "I lost everything." Daniel leaned forward. "No. You gave me away." The words didn't echo, but the silence after did. Then Daniel asked, "Why that day? Why the baseball game?" David didn't answer right away, just stared past him like he was watching a different version of himself walk a child through a crowded stadium. "Because I knew you'd be happy," I thought. If it had to happen, at least let it start with a good day. Daniel set the phone down, didn't slam it, just let it go. Then stood and left the room without looking back. Outside, he didn't say anything until we were halfway down the road. Then he asked if I still had the copies of the ledgers. I told him I did. He nodded once, then leaned his head against the window. I asked if he was okay. He didn't answer, just whispered, "He didn't break because of what he did. He broke because I lived." We got back to town that afternoon. Monica called while I was checking my messages. Her voice was tight-clipped. "Are you sitting down?" she asked. "We just finished going through the rest of the files from the cabin." They'd found a second box locked tucked beneath a false floorboard in the far corner of the back room. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes, recordings, journals, ledgers. Most were duplicates backups, but one item stood out. A page marked Client 27, Final Invoice. It wasn't just a list of names. It was an agreement. Payment confirmed. Services rendered. Delivery completed. Signature at the bottom, D. Carter. She faxed us the document. I saw Daniel read it with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from disbelief, but from knowing you were right and wishing you weren't. That evening, Elliot stopped by with a box he said had been sitting in his attic since before the shelter was remodeled. He wasn't sure what it was. Just said he found it when digging through old volunteer files. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside was a pirate's glove, a signed game program, and a laminated ticket stub from July 18, 2006. Beneath it all, carefully folded, was the yellow cap. The original. Not the one he burned. The real one. Edges frayed, brim soft. He held it gently, then looked at me and said, "I thought I was done with this." "Maybe you are," I said. "Or maybe you're just ready to remember it without letting it own you." He didn't reply, just placed it back in the box and pushed it aside. That night he called Susan. She'd been moved to a secure care facility just outside of town. He hadn't spoken to her since that last visit, but she'd been asking. The staff said she'd stopped eating, stopped responding to most people. But when he walked into her room, she looked up and smiled faintly. "I used to dream of this," she said, "of you walking through that door." Daniel sat beside her. "You don't have to explain," he told her, but she did anyway. "You want to ask why I didn't fight harder, why I believed your father?" She paused. I was broken. He told me you were gone, that it was my fault, and I believed him because I wanted to." Daniel didn't cry. He just reached for her hand. She opened the nightstand drawer and pulled out something wrapped in a faded handkerchief, a silver locket. Inside a photo of Mikey and one of her holding him as a baby. "I wore this every day," she said. "I wanted to keep you close even if I couldn't have you back." He took the locket and closed it gently, then held it in his palm as if weighing the years between them. Monica filed the case with the Department of Justice 2 days later. The trafficking network tied to the Kinland brothers unraveled faster than anyone expected. 3 more children were identified from the tapes. 2 still missing. One, now in his 30s, stepped forward after seeing Daniel's name in a survivor group post. Matthew Kinland was arrested while trying to leave the state. He refused to speak to agents, to lawyers, to anyone until Daniel's name came up during intake. He looked up and said, "You think I'm the worst thing in this story? Look closer." He was right. David was moved from federal hold to a secure psychiatric facility pending trial. He waived all rights, didn't ask for representation, didn't speak again. Daniel was given the option to testify or submit a written statement. He chose both. Not just for himself, but for the others. The ones crossed out on the list. The ones never found. The ones still waiting for their names to surface. And on the day the case officially opened, Daniel stood in front of PNC Park. Not for a game, not for closure, just to be there. To take back the space where it all began. He pulled an envelope from his pocket inside were the burned remains of the first cap. He scattered the ashes into the breeze that rolled in off the Allegheny, then stood quietly as people passed, none of them recognizing the man who had once vanished on the very ground beneath their feet. And when he turned to leave, he whispered, "I'm not that kid anymore." But even as he walked away, I knew a part of him would always carry the weight of the boy who never got to come home. And he wasn't walking away from that. He was walking with it. The indictment reached over 200 pages. Nearly every name tied to the Kinland ring appeared in one form or another: transport drivers, off-the-books social workers, brokers, listed only by initials and burner phone trails. Agent Green walked us through it in a quiet room with no windows. Daniel sat beside me, hands folded, jaw set. When she finished laying it out, he didn't ask for names, just said, "What happens to the ones still waiting?" Monica hesitated, then told him the truth. Some had been moved so many times so young that tracing them was like chasing wind through a maze of false records. Others had aged out into silence. And a few she lowered her voice were likely never meant to be found. That was the part Daniel didn't flinch at. The silence, the loss, the quiet forfeiture of memory. But the idea that some might still be waiting under different names in different cities, thinking no one remembered, that's what stayed with him. We left the briefing without speaking. Outside, the air felt heavier, early summer heat rolling in. Monica stopped us at the car. She handed Daniel a sealed manila envelope. "From David," she said. "We had it screened. No threats, no codes, just words. You don't have to read it." Daniel nodded, took it, and set it in the glove box. He didn't open it. Later that week, the plea deal hit the news. Matthew Kinland would serve life without parole in exchange for information on the remaining network. It wasn't mercy. It was leverage. He didn't ask for sympathy, just wanted certain names redacted from the public record. Names we never saw. Monica suspected at least 2 were still in positions of influence: state contracts, foster licensing boards. Daniel didn't ask for confirmation. He just kept showing up to hearings interviews, survivor roundtables. Not for closure, he said, for clarity. He started visiting shelters anonymously. One in Columbus, another near Scranton. No interviews, no cameras, just quiet conversations with the staff. A few nights he stayed late to sit with the kids, said nothing about who he was or why he was there. Just sat and listened. Sometimes that was enough. One of the boys, a teenager named Elijah, gave him a drawing, a figure standing beneath stars holding a light. He remembers the ones who got taken, the kid said. Daniel kept it folded in his wallet. The real change came 2 months later. I got a call from Daniel early on a Thursday morning. "There's someone you need to meet," he said. I didn't ask questions, just drove. The house sat at the end of a quiet street in Slippery Rock, a single-story ranch with a maple tree out front and a cracked sidewalk running up to the porch. Daniel answered the door. His posture was different, straighter but softer somehow, like something had realigned inside him. In the living room sat an older woman with short white hair and a worn cardigan. "This is Martha," he said. "She lived 2 doors down from where we used to be." She looked up with eyes that carried decades. "I saw it happen," she said quietly. "The day he didn't come home. I saw David leave that morning early, alone. Came back late. No kid, no glove, just his car and silence." She'd never spoken up, afraid of getting it wrong, afraid of what it might stir. "I always knew something was off," she added. "But you tell yourself maybe it's not your place." She reached into her purse and pulled out a plastic bag. Inside a small green dinosaur toy, weathered but intact. He dropped it the day before. I meant to return it. I never did. Daniel held the toy in both hands like it was glass. "I remember this," he whispered. That afternoon he drove to the lake. The same lake from the photo, the one labeled NON. Monica and I followed behind. No press, no announcement, just us. We stood near the edge beneath a patch of trees that bent low over the water. He pulled something from his pocket, a small folded paper, the one from the box in the butcher shop, the drawing taped to a note. "You were my reset." He held it over the water for a long time, then let it go. It drifted until it was out of sight. The past, he once said, doesn't vanish, it just waits to be seen clearly. And maybe for the first time he was ready to see it for what it was. Not just a wound, but a map. The Department of Justice closed the investigation with 31 confirmed victims, 27 living, 4 deceased. Of those who came forward, nearly all credited the reemergence of Daniel the name. They remembered the name that vanished from the posters as the reason they spoke. A few had artifacts, birthday photos, VHS clips, drawings with names erased and replaced. Some remembered only pieces. Others remembered everything but never trusted themselves. Daniel never positioned himself as a symbol. He refused interviews beyond a single statement submitted in writing. "We were not erased. We were misplaced. And we are still finding each other." Susan passed quietly 3 weeks after the final conviction. Natural causes, they said. The staff found her holding the silver locket, the one with the baby picture and the boy in the cap. Daniel didn't speak at the service, but he placed the locket beside her before they closed the casket. No flowers, just a note that read, "We made it." After that, he disappeared for a while. Not in the way he once was hidden, stolen, renamed, but intentionally. No calls, no updates. I'd send a message now and then, never sure if he read them. Then on the 1-year mark, I got a postcard. No return address, no city, just a hand-drawn red dinosaur, a yellow cap, and 3 words. Still here. Daniel. Some names are erased, others are taken. But some endure, not by surviving, but by choosing to be remembered. The last time I saw Daniel in person, it was just past dusk. The porch light on his new place flickered once when I rang the bell, then steadied. He opened the door wearing that same yellow cap from the photo, washed out now, brim, soft, but still holding its shape. He didn't say anything right away, just nodded and stepped aside. The living room was quiet, sparsely furnished. A small shelf held framed drawings from the shelters. No medals, no plaques, just paper, ink, and color. We talked for a long time without saying much how things were going, what might come next. At one point he asked, "Do you think a name ever really comes back?" I didn't answer. I think he already knew. Sometimes we reclaim it piece by piece through memory, through witness, through the simple act of being known again. Daniel still goes by both names. Owen Granger on legal forms, work, IDs, anything tied to the world that held him all those years. But to the ones who knew him back then, the ones who waited or searched or carried some fragment of his story, he's just Daniel. And that's enough. He started working with a recovery nonprofit last fall. No press, no interviews, just quiet visits to places most people overlook. A halfway home in Zanesville, a foster program near Erie. He brings a red toy boat, sometimes one just like the one from the lake. Leaves it in common rooms. Doesn't explain it. Just lets it be found. The last page of the ledger they recovered from the butcher shop is sealed in evidence now. Monica told me it had a list of initials, not names, followed by cities and dates. The final entry read, D. Carter, client 27. There was a time when I thought that line would be the end of the story. The twist, the revelation, the thing people remembered. But now I think it's just the midpoint. What matters more is what came after. The people who stepped forward. The ones who stayed. The ones who rebuilt even quietly without expecting anyone to notice. That's the part that lasts. Martha passed away that winter. Natural causes, peacefully at home. In her will, she left Daniel a small box of keepsakes. Inside was the green dinosaur toy, a Polaroid of her late husband, and a note written in unsteady cursive, "We remember what matters. I'm glad you came back." He keeps it in a drawer next to the locket from Susan's things. He doesn't open it often, just enough to remind himself that memory once shared doesn't vanish. As for me, I've stayed in touch in the way that matters. Birthdays, quiet check-ins. The occasional late-night call that begins with silence and ends with something like, peace. There's no real ending to this kind of story. Just a decision moment by moment to keep telling the truth, to keep remembering. If you've listened this far, thank you. These stories aren't easy, but they're real. And sometimes just knowing someone else heard them, that makes all the difference. If this one stayed with you, consider sharing it. Say the name, light a candle, leave a comment. However you remember, just don't let it be alone.